Welcome to today's program, which is Energy and Preservation Policy in New York City. I'm Liz Lieber. I'm the managing partner at Beyer Blunder-Bell Architects, and I'm a board member with Urban Green Council. Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement. We invite you to be mindful of these during the program, both when you're viewing the presentations and when you're asking questions. And just before we hop into the slideshow and I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to give you some background on this panel discussion. From quoting 2016 data supplied by the Urban Green Council, at that time, there was a total of 3.9 billion square feet of New York City building stock that was subject to ASHRAE 90.1 commercial energy code. And about 430 million square feet of that, or 11% of that total, was within the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission jurisdiction, either by being an individual designated landmark or in a designated district. And of course, there are many interpretations of what distinguishes an existing building from a historic building. We could have an entire panel discussion about that. But in any case, we're starting with that metric to say that it's a meaningful enough slice of the pie and enough of a distinct challenge to energy retrofits in historic buildings that we decided to convene a series of panel discussions in 2021 and 2022 with Urban Green Council. So we wanted the series to provide perspective on how, first of all, and highlighted today, how New York City policy is influencing approaches to achieving energy savings requirements and goals, and various approaches to achieving energy goals through a series of pre- and post-war building case studies, both local and within the region. So please stay tuned for advertisement of these panels that are going to continue through the spring of 2022. And now I'm going to introduce the panelists and then turn it over to our moderator. So I'm very excited to introduce today's panel, and I want to thank them all in advance for their participation. We have Ian Graham, the Deputy Director, Building Emissions of New York City Department of Buildings. Corey Harala, the Director of Preservation at New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, and Elizabeth Kelly, the Assistant Deputy Director for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability. And we are going to be moderated by Lori Carr, who is the President of LK Policy Lab. She's also the former Deputy Director for Green Building Policy at the New York City Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning, and also former Director of Policy at Urban Green. And she will be our moderator this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to her. Lori?
Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for attending this panel. I hope it's as illuminating as we think it's going to be. I'm giving a very brief introduction of the legislative or regulatory landscape. So, big picture, saving our architectural heritage is great for a lot of reasons, including from a carbon point of view, because obviously protecting historic buildings reduces embodied carbon, the carbon emitted during construction and demolition, which people estimate to be, somewhere between a third and a half of the amount of carbon due to operations. And that's why historic preservation and sustainability have so often been seen as kind of allied strategies. But there's been a really serious impediment to progress on energy efficiency in historic buildings in New York State, and that's the New York State Energy Law. That law exempts buildings that are listed as national or state landmarks from having to comply with the Energy Code in any way, shape, or form. What does this mean? Buildings like the Empire State Building don't even have to comply, theoretically, according to the law, with even the Energy Code for upgrades to lighting systems. It also, the state energy also exempts buildings that are considered eligible to be listed, and that can be a big loophole at the national or state level. So on the other hand, local landmarks are captured by the Energy Code. But what this big exemption means is that many of our historic buildings aren't regularly accruing the energy efficiency improvements that come along at the time of regular upgrades like other buildings do. But that's changing. And so people who are used to working with these historic landmarks need to know that those days of exemptions are likely over, and particularly for larger buildings, there are going to be strict requirements. So one change that's coming down the pike possibly is an omnibus bill that was passed by the New York State Senate in June, and it removes that historic exemption, leaving it open to the Code Council to exempt specific requirements. So no more absolute requirement, and depending on what the Code Council decides to do, maybe minimal circumscribed requirement exemptions will be embedded in the codes. So assuming that passes the Assembly this spring, all historic buildings will then have to meet the energy code when they renovate. An even bigger change for the larger buildings is Local Law 97. And that, of course, requires all buildings over 25,000 square feet to meet decreasing carbon caps until they achieve an 80% reduction in aggregate by 2050. And no historic buildings are exempted from that. It's not a code, so it's not captured by the state energy law. That said, there's no automatic exemption. There's a possible adjustment that can be applied for, but it's not going to be granted as of right. So one will have to apply and hope, and if the argument can be successfully made, maybe there can be an adjustment to the level of reductions, but no absolute requirement. So from this point of view, these two changes are going to ensure that our historic building stock isn't stuck in the past, and it's going to be part of our decarbonized future going forward. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Ian Graham from Department of Buildings, who's going to go into much more detail on Local Law 97.
Thanks, Lori. So yes, as Lori said, Ian Graham, Deputy Director for Building Emissions. Grateful to be here today among these panelists to talk about historic buildings, and particularly to talk about, here we go. Now I have access to, can I do this? No, I can't. Talk about Local Law 97 and where it all fits in. One thing I would like to point out, there's a lot, hold on, going on with respect to everything around energy consumption and what's happening. Urban Green just recently put out a report on the state of our electric grid, and the ability for it to handle electrification is one of the things that's coming up. New York State, NYSERDA and New York State just announced the Tier 4 awards for renewable energy credits to bring more renewable power into New York City. And, you know, the mayor's office challenge for a carbon trading study has also been recently reported. So there's a lot going on in the industry. It seems like every day there's new information and there's new data to figure out how and where we're all headed as a society. But right now, let's talk a little bit about Local Law 97 specifically. Again, it's going to be sort of the 1,000-foot view, just to get people sort of oriented. And let's start with where it came from. So it came out of the Climate Mobilization Act, which passed in 2019 by a vote of 45-2. So there's overwhelming support. These 4 laws, local laws that are up here, are sort of the preeminent ones that shape sort of the landscape of the sustainable and green building movement that we're sort of forging along. Local laws 92 and 94, making mandates for green roofs and solar PVs for a lot of buildings. Local law 95, which just recently rolled out, and I think this is the second year or third year we'll be going into, where building energy grades are being posted on the outside of buildings, depending on what their Energy Star scores are based on their benchmarking. Local Law 96, you know, a law that enables PACE financing for properties, to a way to unlock funds to make the upgrades necessary to improve the energy performance of buildings. And then Local Law 97, right? And with firm commitments to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by both 2030 and 2050. A little bit about emissions. So those reductions are based on 2005 as a benchmark. Right now, the 2016 emissions about 51,000. So we're part of the way along that path. The bar charts over here give you a sense in terms of where buildings fit into this overall picture. So about 67% of the energy of the emissions in the city are from buildings, right? And that 80-50 scenario we're getting down, you can see it's going to be quite the reduction. Along the way, in addition to reducing 6 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere, and thereby helping reduce the impact that we may all have on climate change as we move forward, we're anticipating about almost 27,000 jobs created in the green sector. Okay, so aside from the jobs created, cleaning up the environment will have direct benefit in terms of improving health of all the citizens, right? So we have about 150 hospitalizations avoided per year, and about 50 to 130 deaths prevented per year just by cleaning up the air we all breathe. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Local Law 97 and who it affects. As mentioned previously by some of the other panelists, 25,000 square foot is sort of a basic benchmark for what are covered buildings under Articles 320 and 321 of Chapter 28 of our law. There are separate criteria set portfolio-wide for the city and NYCHA that are also part of Local Law 97. To set additional requirements, but others are responsible for enforcing that, and not the Department of Buildings. And the big one that everyone's thinking about is what affects most of the buildings in the city. So 25,000 square foot is a basic benchmark. If, however, properties have multiple buildings on a lot, the whether or not those properties are covered by the law depends on the square footage in aggregate of all those buildings on the lot. So if the aggregate square footage is over 50,000 square feet, then all the buildings on that lot are also covered. So you could have buildings less than 25,000. Owners need to be aware of the nuances there to determine which properties and which buildings on those properties are impacted. At the outset of the work that we've been doing, the law calls for convening an advisory board and working groups to address open issues within the law. If any of you have read the details of the law, you'll see that there's a lot which has been laid out, but there's a lot of room for filling in blanks or making adjustments within the law. The advisory board and the working groups have been discussing those details and issues from the perspectives, multiple perspectives, specific to building sectors, commercial buildings, multifamily buildings, hospitals. There's a group that's dealing with carbon accounting issues. We have one that's looking at the grid and how it interfaces and what kind of impacts and what the future looks like for the grid. And we also have a communications group to talk about how to get the word out and what ways we can improve communications about what's happening with the law to the public. Greenhouse gas emissions limits, again, apply to buildings generally over 25,000 square feet, with the caveat that I mentioned previously. Also within this, there's a study for a carbon trading scheme, which has recently been completed and released by the city for public review and public consumption, basically. City operations, actually, before I move on there, the one thing to remember about the carbon trading scheme, there's nothing in the law specifically right now that mandates carbon trading be part of the process. Okay, that's what the study was intended to do. So if carbon trading is going to become part of what happens, it will require revision to legislation or new legislation. City operations, as I mentioned previously, city operations has its own metrics. In fact, they're somewhat more stringent than the metrics for the public at large. City operations greenhouse gas reductions are targeted to be reduced by 40% by 2025 and 50% by 2030. Right now, the goals that we have in the law for covered buildings in the public sector, the private buildings that are out there, are to get to 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. All right. And the 80% target still applies to city buildings and NYCHA properties as well. All right. So when does it get real? I would say actually that we've actually started taking applications for adjustments. There were 2 adjustment programs that were available for properties with significant excess emissions and for not-for-profit healthcare that we started accepting in June, that were due by the end of June or in July for not-for-profit healthcare. But for the lion's share of properties, 2024 calendar year is when things, when the energy bills start to count, okay? With reporting to the Department of Buildings on May 1st of 2025, and then every year thereafter for each calendar year preceding the reporting year. As you read the law, the emissions limits they get significantly more stringent for calendar year 2030 moving forward. And we're actually working right now on assessing what it will look like for years beyond 2035 and beyond. Okay, the limits that are in the law were intended to align with the city's 40 by 30 goal, which I mentioned previously. So again, it becomes a benchmark around which we have to review whether we're hitting success and whether we're going in the direction that we need to go to achieve that 80% reduction by 2050. Again, as I mentioned, 2035 and beyond, we're working on rulemaking, and we'll be working on rulemaking based on recommendations and the discussions from the advisory board and the working groups. And finally, a lot of what we talk about when it comes to limits and so forth are really for a certain subset of covered buildings. There's a group of covered buildings which are exempt from all of this that we've talked about, which is in Article 320, and are subject to the requirements in Article 321. Okay, and those are for rent-regulated properties with rent-regulated dwelling units with more than 35% rent-regulated dwelling units within the property. Okay, they have the option. Or not the option. They fall under Article 321, and yet there are options there. One is a performance option, but it's a fairly stringent one. But there is a list of prescriptive energy conservation measures that's also there. That those properties subject to it, as long as they can show that by the end of 2024 they've met the requirements for all applicable requirements on that prescriptive list, then they're deemed compliant as well. All right. Within the law, there are also, there's limits, and then you take your energy bills and then you calculate what your actual emissions are. The law identifies the coefficients for different energy sources. This chart here actually puts them in common units in terms of kBTUs. If you read the law proper, it gives you a metric for per kilowatt hour for electricity, but generally just to get a sense of comparison, what those values look like. Okay, the law identifies these specific ones, but you can see at the bottom, there are other energy sources that are out there that people use. The more common ones, actually, when we developed the adjustments program that I mentioned before, we have a filing guide. That filing guide identifies a few others. We are working with the working groups now on coefficients that might be related to distributed energy resources and any other energy sources that are common in New York City that will be there. Uncommon ones, we have asked for applicants to let us know what they're using and make a case for a coefficient that's appropriate with that energy source. Okay. So you've got a limit. There's a whole series of limits associated with different occupancy groups. That determines the budget for a property. So if a property is broken down into multiple uses, there'd be an associated limit for each of those uses. Multiply the gross square footage of that use by the associated limit. Do that for each occupancy group, add it all up, that becomes the building's budget. So each building gets potentially its own specific budget. Okay. How that's determined is based upon registered architects and engineers. They're going to need to calculate these budgets, and then later to certify the reporting on the actual energy consumption for the building, right? So the law requires that emissions reporting be submitted and certified by registered design professionals. Okay. If a building exceeds its greenhouse gas budget, then it's subject to a penalty up to $268 a metric ton for carbon dioxide. Okay, that's the big ticket there. So there are teeth there. There are also penalties for registered design professionals materially misrepresenting the energy performance or the limits for a property. With steep fines for the professionals that do that as well. Okay, so this law has teeth. Prescriptive measures. So this is the prescriptive measures I mentioned before. Again, rent regulated buildings with rent regulated properties more than 35%. Okay, have option of demonstrating compliance using the list of prescriptive measures you see on the screen. I won't read them all individually to you, but I will tell you that some of these are fairly extensive. There's work to be done here. Some will be easier, some are relatively straightforward and easy, some might be more involved. At the end of the day, they will all help buildings get a hold of the energy consumption that's going on and help them to manage what's happening. Earlier, we were talking about the fact that there are too many properties in New York City that in the wintertime, people have to open their windows to control the temperature. The hope and the goal is that this law and these types of measures and the changes that are coming and are necessary to comply with the law will help to get a hold of that and make more comfortable buildings that are less detrimental to our climate. And with that, that's the goal of Local Law 97. I guess we'll talk more later. And right now, I just want to introduce Corey Harola from Landmarks.
Okay, thank you, Ian, and good morning, everyone. My name is Corey Harola. I am the Director of Preservation at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I'm happy to be here to participate in this discussion addressing energy and preservation policy in the context of the city's climate change mobilization strategies and the adaptation of our historic resources. So today I'd like to share our approach and some of our recent regulatory work. I do want to start by saying that we are a municipal agency with a mandate to designate and regulate historic resources. So our mandate is not as broad as other agencies that directly address energy policies. However, we do coordinate with our sister agencies and on these issues when it makes sense for us to do so. But again, our primary work is driven by our mandate. Some in this audience may not be familiar with LPC at all, so I'll begin with a little bit of background. The Landmarks Preservation Commission is the mayoral agency responsible for protecting and preserving New York City's architecturally, historically, and culturally significant buildings and sites. And so again, key takeaway, we designate and regulate historic resources. Current priorities that guide our actions include ensuring diversity in designations to make sure we're telling the stories of all New Yorkers, effective outreach both for regulatory work and in garnering support for designation while recognizing New York City's incredible diversity, fairness, transparency, and efficiency in regulations so that proposed work is approved in a timely manner and that we are supporting property owners through technical assistance and improved guidance, and addressing sustainability and resiliency issues in all aspects of the agency's work, which I'll detail today in terms of our regulatory work. Today, let me go back one slide. Okay, I seem to be missing one slide. I'll just sort of talk through what it was supposed to show. And that is that today we actually have more than 38,000 designated buildings and sites in the city. That includes over 1,400 individual landmarks, 152 historic districts, 121 interior landmarks, and 11 scenic landmarks. It's a large number of designated buildings, to be sure, a little less than 5% of the overall building stock, just to put that in perspective. And the majority of them are small buildings, but several thousand are buildings larger than 25,000 square feet, and therefore subject to Local Law 97. We receive approximately 11,000 or so applications a year for work on these designated properties. The agency works very closely with property owners, architects, and other members of the design team to help them make changes to their buildings in a way that, both supports their clients' needs and maintains the character of the landmark. It's important to note that before the pandemic and subsequent economic situation, LPC received approximately 14,000 applications per year. And so the number of applications that we've seen so far in 2021 is on the rise and already greater than 2020. So it's definitely trending upwards. We don't actually track energy efficiency projects per se, but we do have the ability to track applications that identify certain work types on our application forms, like solar panels and high performance windows, and we do check that periodically. Those have been on the rise as well. So 94 to 97% of our applications each year go through a ministerial staff level approval process pursuant to the commission rules. These are found in Title 63 of the Rules of the City of New York. And over the past 50 years, the commission has developed rules that allow a faster and more streamlined review of some applications by the staff. This allows the agency to be more efficient and responsive to property owners who want to make these kinds of changes. Basically, the staff is authorized to issue these permits because the commission has determined the work has no effect on protected architectural features or is always appropriate and is delegated authority to the staff. Applicants work one-on-one with a staff person, and if the work meets the rules or can be adjusted to meet the rules, the staff can issue that permit. Examples of the type of work that can usually be approved at staff level are listed above, and there are many more. For today's purposes, I've highlighted window replacement, mechanical equipment, and interior work. And I'll note that our definition of mechanical equipment covers both HVAC and energy equipment like generators and solar panels. Exterior work connected to energy efficiency upgrades is pretty routine in terms of our review process and usually eligible for a staff level permit. Our review of interior work that must also be filed with DOB is minimal and generally focused on structural interventions. Additionally, weatherization measures on the exterior, such as adding weather stripping and air sealing, can be done without a permit. Taking a look at this photo, clearly what you see here is not glamorous, but like many flat roofs, this one's being put to good use. It's the perfect location to install mechanical equipment, such as those that might be related to electrifying buildings or complying with local laws 92 and 94, among other things. Due to minimal or no visibility and the lack of significant historic features, rooftop installations almost always qualify for staff level review. The remainder of our applications are reviewed by our full commission at a public hearing. These are for projects that do not meet the rules and require a special case-by-case review. This would be an example of visible additions to properties or new buildings in historic districts, most easily recognizable. We have also reviewed at least a couple of proposals recently for large visible mechanical equipment upgrades located on setbacks, and these projects have identified future compliance with local law 97 as the reason for the work. And in each case, the commissioners found the work to be appropriate to the building and approved it. But again, most applications for routine work at historic buildings are reviewed at staff level pursuant to the rules. Speaking of the rules, as you may know, the commission adopted updated rules in January 2019 to further streamline the permitting process and make the regulatory process more efficient and transparent. Amending the rules was important to make sure that our regulations continue to be nimble and evolve to meet modern needs and the use of new technologies. The rules now address barrier-free access in order to ensure buildings can be made accessible. And for the first time, they also address sustainability and resiliency measures, such as the installation of high-performance windows, solar panels, and flood-proofing measures. There's also a new extensive restoration chapter, which is obviously important for historic preservation efforts in general, but also for keeping buildings well-maintained or repairing them to support optimal energy performance in conjunction with insulation, air sealing, and other interior upgrades. In the introduction to the HVAC chapter of the rules, we also took the opportunity to voice our support for installing appropriate HVAC and mechanical equipment that meets or exceeds the requirements of the NYC Energy Conservation Code, even if the equipment is exempt from such standards, and perhaps it might not be for long. And that was before we knew that local law 97 would start to force the issue by going about it in a different way. So now that I've told everyone that most of the types of works that are contemplated for energy retrofits can be reviewed at staff level, the question of how to actually get the permit remains. We've worked hard to make applying for and getting a permit a smooth and predictable process. Our application forms were recently redesigned, and the forms, drawings, and supporting materials prepared by applicants are now all submitted and reviewed electronically. We have many general and specific assistance materials available online, such as our expansive and user-friendly permit guidebook, the rules, and various tech sheets. The staff is also available to provide guidance before and during the application process. Many of our staff preservationists hold special desks that focus on specific areas of work that often help streamline the process. And the takeaway for this audience is that LPC has issued guidance on how to navigate our application process to sensitively improve the energy performance of historic buildings, including subjects such as solar panel installations, window retrofitting and replacement, and passive house or similar high performance standards. And we have preservationists on staff that are very familiar with these types of work. In the last several years, we've seen a number of row houses and several loft buildings renovated using the passive house standard or something close to it to dramatically improve the energy efficiency of these historic buildings. The certified passive house renovation of an Upper West Side row house seen in this photo is an example of just that. All of these projects have kept the historic front facade intact, and many have retained much of the interior framing and the rear facade as well. Clearly, these projects are heavy on building science, and care must be taken to find the right balance in the context of insulating and air sealing historic buildings. But over time, what has been reported back to us is that these buildings are performing very well on all counts. The biggest challenge to doing these projects at LPC designated buildings had been the windows. LPC has long approved new windows with insulated glass and low E coatings, but high performance triple glazed windows with tight seals are required for these projects, which ruled out typical modern double hung windows. A compromise of sorts was reached with the development of new hinged windows with offset sashes, simulating the appearance of double hung windows. When closed, most people can't tell the difference. When open, the inward tilt or swing makes the change in operation inconspicuous. And for years, the staff could not approve these windows, and each time the full commission review was required through the public hearing process. That changed with the 2019 rule amendments, and the staff is now able to approve them regularly in a simple, predictable process, provided a high standard of detail is maintained and the historic configurations and finishes are matched. And I'd like to conclude by saying that LPC recognizes that landmarks can change and evolve. We believe the city's historic buildings should be improved in terms of energy efficiency and be prepared for the impacts of climate change. Citywide energy policies are set by the mayor's office and other agencies, but we seek to coordinate with them and take the goals set in those plans and adapt them to our work. We try very hard to think creatively and are always open to new ideas and approaches. The 2019 rules amendments are a perfect example where we engaged in peer review with staff from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, as well as the Urban Green Council in developing them. Through LPC's regulatory experience, we have found that many energy efficiency measures have minimal to no effect on a building's historic features. Most upgrades occur inside the building envelope, like air sealing, insulation, lighting, and MEP upgrades. And effective exterior measures tend to have minimal impact and are sometimes even restorative, including facade maintenance, window and door weatherization, retrofits and replacements, and installations of mechanical equipment at discrete locations. I'd like to finish up here. Moving forward, the Commission seeks new partnerships with city agencies where there's jurisdictional overlap or complementary initiatives aimed at improving energy efficiency and sustainability of historic resources, while preserving their special architectural and historic character. Working closely with the NYC Accelerator would be a welcome partnership, so I'll plant that seed today. So thanks everyone. I'll look forward to the discussion and answering questions at the end of the session, but for now I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Kelly.
Great, thanks Corey. My name is Elizabeth Kelly. I am the Assistant Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability. We've heard a lot from Ian and Corey and Lori about the kind of the state of New York and New York City as it relates to energy policy and the impact on historic buildings. And I did want to start my slides with just a little bit of additional high-level framing about why is the city doing this? And for those of you who might have attended Urban Green Council events in the past or are familiar with this conversation, these stats are probably not unfamiliar to you, but important to, I think, to highlight the impact that buildings and the built environment have on emissions coming from the city. 68% of all of the city's emissions coming from buildings. That's why we have energy code. That's why we have Local Law 97, the Climate Mobilization Act, and such a such a focus on the work that needs to be done in buildings, but also support and technical resources and assistance and incentive programs and financing programs to also help this population of the buildings, but also more importantly, the people that live in those buildings, the people that work in the buildings, and the community of stakeholders and individuals who work with the building sector, from architects, engineers, consultants, property managers, supers, operators, the whole gamut. So I'm excited to share with you a little bit more information about the New York City Accelerator, which launched this year. It is a technical assistance program to help all of those actors that I was just rattling off meet local energy law, comply with local energy law, like Local Law 97 and others, increase performance, energy savings, and most importantly to the city to reduce carbon emissions across the 1 million buildings that we have here in New York City. The program really aims to be a one-stop shop for market actors in the industry. All of this information might have been that was presented by Ian and Corey. Maybe it's the first time you've heard of it. Maybe it's the 5th time you've heard this version of this presentation. It's a lot to understand and get your head around. So if whether it's that you're here at the beginning or you've heard this and you're starting to get your feet wet, there's always an opportunity to come to the accelerator, meet one-on-one with a personal portfolio or account manager, talk about your property or your portfolio, what the unique challenges are for your building, and then the program will sit with you and really develop an action plan or a capital plan to meet both your mission goals, your budget goals, your capital planning goals, etc. So in addition to this free guidance to help make sure that your building is compliant and reducing emissions, we also offer trainings, both that are developed internally or like in-house different trainings, as well as our website is a great place to go to find out about other trainings offered by other partners in the industry. We connect building decision makers or the program participants directly to the service providers that implement decarbonization projects. So maybe you already have an engineer or an architect that you've worked with on past retrofits. Great, keep working with that person. But if you're not, or you're interested in exploring new options or need a referral for someone who does something that you know the technician that you previously worked with doesn't have experience working on, that's a great reason to come to the accelerator so we can help you be put in touch with the right service provider. And then, of course, incentives and financing is always part of this equation. And I think I have a little bit more on how we can help assist with that in a slide or two. So here's the kind of customer journey map at a very high level. You learn, potential participant, you learn about NYC Accelerator and how we can help you. This is a version of that, but we can go into a much more tailored version of this in a one-on-one meeting, or present to a board or your group, whatever that consists of. We do a building needs assessment. That's both like a desktop and sometimes like a virtual building tour, but taking all the data that the city has collected through local law 84 benchmarking, through energy audit compliance, as well as other information that we have from city records to really understand, like, where is your building, what are the energy needs, what are the system needs, what other compliance deadlines might you have coming up. So this holistic look at your property, and then working with you as a partner, identify what the energy conservation measures are, and really, like I said, put together a plan to, like, what are we going to start on today, but what does phasing in projects look like over the next 5 or 10 years in order to comply with Local 197 or meet other goals that you may have. We can support kind of as a, not quite an official owner's rep, but we can definitely stay involved through implementation of those measures, making sure that things are going smoothly, that if there's any hiccups that come up, we can be part of that kind of the value engineering process to make sure that we're still meeting the goals of energy reduction and emission reduction, as well as staying on budget. And usually participants start with 1 or 2 projects, and then kind of this whole process repeats itself as you take on more and more, because the measures that need to be done in order to comply with Local 197 and reduce emissions are pretty comprehensive, and figuring out how to sequence those based off of timing, tenant issues, budget, staff capacity is very complicated. And so we encourage people to take this kind of multi-layer phased approach and help you work on that. And so once you complete phase 1, it's time to start again at the beginning. There are plenty of resources available for building teams that are interested in pursuing energy efficiency and retrofits. Most of them might be familiar to a lot of you, but there are a lot and they change often, maybe on a yearly basis. So again, instead of going through every single one of these, I really encourage you to reach out to the accelerator. I have a slide with our contact information, or go to our website, nyc.gov/accelerator, where we actually have on our resource page an incentive map. So you can kind of check the boxes and filter for what type of a project you're working on, and it'll show you what type of active incentives are available for your project. There's also tons of pilots and different offerings coming out of the state in support of the energy laws, and that Lori was talking about. And I anticipate there to be more and more coming online all the time. So again, it's a lot for maybe your sustainability person at your organization to stay on top of all of that. But again, use the accelerator as a resource to help you navigate all of this. The other thing that might be new information, you're like, yeah, incentives from the utilities in the state, we know about that. But commercial properties has clean energy financing, or PACE financing, which is a loan program, was just launched in May, and it is run through the NYC Accelerator and a third party called the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, or NYSEC. And this offers low cost, long term, like up to 30-year financing for energy efficiency projects, and definitely something to look into. We just had we have some webinars posted on our website that provide overviews of that, and I would definitely encourage anyone who's pursuing substantial work to look into PACE financing as a possible way to fund those projects. So thank you so much. Again, here is our website, our QR code, our email, and our phone number. But please pull up the website now while you can and have it in your browser and explore after the conclusion of the panel presentation. Thank you so much.
So thank you, panelists. I thought that was Ian, Carrie, and Elizabeth. I thought all of that was incredibly informative. And it's awfully great to hear, Elizabeth, about all those resources that are available, because this can be quite a thicket for people to think through if they haven't done it before. It's a whole new frontier in terms of thinking long-term about buildings. So with that, I'm going to ask a couple of questions before we turn it over to the audience. First one is thinking about electrification in relation to existing buildings. That's obviously one of the bigger strategies for achieving some of the local law 97 goals. Electrification, you all probably know what that means, but switching from fuel-fired heating and domestic hot water systems primarily to some sort of heat pump, electrified heating and hot water generation. How are historic buildings, how's this going to affect historic buildings? Anybody want to tell us a little bit?
Before I let someone with more of a technical background perhaps answer that question, I do just want to remark about, or pay homage to the amount of energy transitions a lot of New York City's historic buildings have gone through. Most of these buildings were built, or many of them were built when coal was king and there was no electricity. And so it's just, and they modernized for electricity, and there's just been such an interesting evolution of the history of these properties, and even into the digital age and retrofitting office buildings to allow for computers and phones at every single desk and every workspace. So I really think the challenge does seem daunting, but it's not something that's beyond what these buildings have done in the past, and the technologies that are required for electrification are very much similar from ground up new construction to a retrofit of a building. So you're kind of looking at the same types of packages. The challenges for historic is going to be the same as the challenge for any kind of a occupied retrofit building, is phasing this in, minimal disturbance to tenants. But I think chief among all of this, and it gets lost in the shuffle, but is like planning and coordination with all of the trades and all of the professionals that are involved in this type of work.
I think what I was getting at is you've got going to have a lot of heat pumps, perhaps, a lot of condenser units outside. How is that going to be handled? Are there strategies that might work especially well with historic buildings to solve some of those potential visual intrusions?
It's going to be a challenge, right? I mean, you've got heat pumps, and it depends on the historic building you're talking about in terms of the way it's currently heated and cooled, or cooled, if it is cooled. That's one nice thing about if you're switching over to heat pumps, buildings that historically may not have had central air conditioning might actually get it. But if you're dealing with, baseboard or radiators into boilers, it's going to be a different move than if you're dealing with through the wall PTAC systems, right? Or things along that line. You're right, Lori, that finding room to put air-cooled condensing units could be quite challenging for some buildings. If you got a big flat roof and there's a lot of real estate up there, yeah, you're going to have room for it. I mean, one of Corey's pictures showed, a solar panel up there, and while there was room for some equipment up there, you can also tell pretty quickly that real estate's pretty dear, and it'll be challenging. I know of residential projects, larger scale residential projects, to tap into the earth, potentially digging wells and going geothermal. It's a lot more challenging. Getting a well into the basement of an existing building could be very difficult. But those are other options as well. And again, it's going to depend tremendously on where the building is, how it's currently heated or cooled, and how electrification will happen. The simplest switch for a boiler is to go to an electric boiler. That's probably the least desirable way to electrify buildings. Number one, from the energy bill perspective, and number two, from the load that, if you have en masse, transformation to straight electric resistance, a grid that just won't be able to sustain that kind of heating growth. So, I think heat pumps are going to be the solution as you move forward, and it's just going to be, case by case to figure out how you effectively do that. I think that some of the technologies that are out there, rather than individual split units that all have to find a place for a condenser, variable refrigerant flow or refrigerant volume type systems, which can aggregate internal units together, and find a place for one or two or whatever, if you're dealing with smaller residential projects, where they can put those units someplace. It's a little easier to find it one, as opposed to having to find a whole farm of them for each individual unit. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, I just add in terms of landmarks review, if it happens to be one of the locally designated buildings. Yeah, obviously the rooftop is a no-brainer. We also have some staff level provisions in our rules to wall mount units like these when they're at secondary facades, particularly rear facades, ideally where they're not seeing things like that. But we deal with them in other cases as well. I think the good news is at least some of these machines have gotten quite small, and in some cases are no bigger than a window AC unit that sticks out of a window. And so there are kind of ways to kind of think of these things differently and in comparable ways to make them something the commission may ultimately support. I think what is interesting is kind of the competing uses for this real estate now, particularly up on rooftops, where that's the no-brainer where to put these types of things, or solar panels, but people want to use their rooftops now as outdoor space. And so it really has become sort of a cluttered landscape up there, and people have to make decisions about that. So it's an interesting topic.
Liz? Lieber?
Yes. Oh, no, sorry. I will lower my hand.
So another big issue, another big strategy for improving or decreasing the carbon emissions from buildings is improved insulation, particularly in walls. And, Corey, you talked a lot about all the things Landmarks has done to accommodate better windows, and it really is great. Great what you all have done. But what about walls? Do we see any policy issues emerging on this front, on insulating walls?
Well, again, I think that depends on where the insulation goes. If we're talking about interior insulation, where our review is really not substantive to begin with, we depend on the practitioners to be smart about that and balance the kind of the issues of the wall itself with over insulation potentially or things of that nature. And again, what we've had reported back is good, that this works. And we've had plenty of these passive house or near passive house projects do the interior insulation, and it seems to have worked just fine. But, I think the question is often asked, what about exterior insulation? And honestly, for street facades of a designated building, I mean, it's probably a non-starter in most of these cases. To be frank, it's kind of what protecting that building and its character is all about. And if you were to sort of cover that over, it's hard to see how that would work. But that being said, certainly for new buildings, that type of technology and construction method, it makes sense, and we would welcome that. Additions at the roof or at the rear as well, and potentially adding insulation to rear facades, particularly we're not seeing, as something that I think we've done once or twice and might become more acceptable if the need is shown for that. So something we think about a lot, but we really haven't had to deal with it too much at this point.
Well, we only have a minute or two, so let's see if at least there's one question from the audience that should go forward. Let's see. Oh, here's some questions. Someone asked if it would be possible to post a reference to the specific provisions of the omnibus Senate bill. Yes, I can pass that. It's quite an interesting bill, and I'll pass that along to Urban Green, who could go ahead and post that. Anonymous attendee asked about geothermal work for historic buildings. I think we addressed that. Question from Cecil, who used to be at Urban Green. He says he's heard that if you add insulation to bathroom walls and move a fixture, the whole bathroom has to come up to accessibility standards, which might be difficult or costly in New York City layouts. Is this true? Okay, well, that's a question of, I don't know. Does anybody here know that? Okay, someone will try to get back to you on that, Cecil. Okay, well, let's go back to the geothermal question and dig into that maybe during the 1 minute we have left. Anybody want to say anything more? I mean, I will say something a little bit more in terms of, for the audience that may not have been thinking about this, the advantage of geothermal is that it does not have a visible condenser unit. So it's exchanging heat with the ground, heat and coolth with the ground. And so you don't have a visible component that you have to deal with. You also have a benefit that it's quiet. So some of the noise issues that you can get with the air-cooled condensers. So this can be, I think, a very good strategy for historic buildings. That said, it's more expensive, but it's also more efficient in the long run. So you'd have to do the math and see the trade-off. But I think with that, we've come to the end of the hour. And so I'll pass it back to Urban Green.